Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to jump into a new topic.
Absolutely, and today we're tackling something pretty big,
Yeah.
Canadian identity.
Hmm.
We've got these two articles that approach it from different angles.
So
One's looking more at the historical side of things, and the other,
more from like a socio-political lens.
yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
we're going to try to unravel how this idea of being Canadian came to be, how it's evolved, and what it even means today.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, well, right off the bat, both articles jump into this debate
Mm.
about whether a strong national identity is even necessary for a country to exist.
Right out the gate.
I know, right? It's a big one.
Yeah, the first article we're looking at argues that a shared identity is absolutely crucial.
So they're saying, like, it's the foundation?
Pretty much they define a nation by things like shared religion, culture, even race.
Okay, so the state itself is just an expression of that shared identity.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
But then,
There's a bu-
always a but, right? The second article comes in with a completely different take.
What do they say?
They argued that that kind of definition is actually really dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Well, they're saying it sets up this kind of hierarchy of us versus them,
Right.
and that can lead to all sorts of problems. Exclusion, discrimination.
So it's like if we define ourselves too narrowly, we risk leaving people out.
Yeah, and it raises the question of just how much shared culture do we actually need to feel connected as Canadians?
Right. Like, what's the magic formula?
No easy answers there.
Definitely something to think about as we go through this. Okay, so the first article then goes on to make this bold claim. They say Canada is a nation built by loyalists.
Loyalists.
Yeah, loyal to the British Crown.
Okay, but Canada eventually became its own country, though, right?
Of course.
Mm.
But you can't deny the historical ties to British rule.
True.
And this article argues that both English and French Canadians historically show this deep loyalty to authority.
Interesting how...
Well, they say that English Canadians largely rejected the American Revolution, and some even welcomed those who were fleeing the colonies.
The loyalists.
Yeah, exactly, the ones who wanted to remain under the crown.
So even back then, there were Canadians who felt a stronger connection to the crown than to the idea of an independent America.
That's what this article suggests.
Makes you think.
And then on the French-Canadian side, they held fast to their Catholic faith and monarchist views.
Even with the French Revolution going on.
Right. It's like both groups were clinging to these traditional values as a defining part of their Canadian identity.
Fascinating how those historical choices really shaped the country.
Absolutely. And speaking of shaping Canada, our second article brings up multiculturalism. They argue that it might have actually weakened that distinct sense of Canadian identity.
The one built on that English and French-Canadian relationship.
Exactly, because, multiculturalism is often seen as a good thing, right?
Embracing diversity, opening up to different cultures.
Totally. But this author argues that while it was meant to accommodate French Canadians and prevent them from being assimilated, it might have accidentally undermined the very thing that made Canada unique,
Which was...
that bicultural foundation, the blend of English and French influences.
Right. They say that's what really set Canada apart from other places, especially the U.S.
So now the question is, does that make Canada less distinct on the world stage?
It's a great question.
Yeah. Is Canada fundamentally multicultural or bicultural?
Definitely something to ponder.
All right, well, while we're pondering that, this second article also critiques how modern Canadian identity is often defined.
What do you mean?
They take issue with this emphasis on shared values.
Okay, like tolerance, equality, human rights, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and all rooted in this secular framework.
Right.
But the author argues that these values are constantly evolving,
So they're not stable.
and they lack the grounding of more traditional principles.
Like what?
The rule of law, for example, which they say has stood the test of time.
Interesting take.
And get this, they even go so far as to say this has led to Canadians being seen as inoffensive, nice guys.
Huh. So we're too polite.
Maybe. I mean, there's that stereotype about Canadians always apologizing.
Right.
But seriously,
Right.
is that all there is to being Canadian? Just avoiding offense?
It's funny, but it makes you think.
And to illustrate this whole point about shifting values, the author brings up the Canadian flag.
The flag. Okay, I'm intrigued.
They contrast the pre-1965 flag, which was packed with historical symbolism,
Oh, yeah.
with the modern maple leaf flag. The old flag had all these references to the monarchy, the founding nations, even the fleur-de-lis.
Right, from French history.
It was like a visual representation of this complex heritage.
So they're saying the old flag was like a history lesson on fabric.
Exactly. But the maple leaf, while iconic, is much more abstract.
It doesn't scream history in the same way.
Right. And the author sees this as a broader trend
A move away from those tangible historical symbols.
towards this more ambiguous sense of what it means to be Canadian.
More inclusive, but maybe less grounded.
So it's like trading in a tapestry woven with threads of history for something sleeker and more modern.
Interesting way to put it.
Okay, now for one of the most provocative claims in this second article,
I'm listening.
they suggest that the decline of traditional institutions like the monarchy and the church
Okay.
has left Canadians in a state of existential purposelessness.
Whoa, that's heavy.
I know, right? They argue this void has been made even worse by multiculturalism's lack of a unifying core.
So without those traditional anchors, Canadians are struggling to find meaning.
That's their argument, and it gets even wilder.
How so?
They propose bringing back the monarchy, maybe even the French Bourbon dynasty,
Yeah.
to restore order and meaning.
Wait, they want to invite a foreign monarchy back. That's a bold idea.
It definitely raises eyebrows.
It really highlights how complicated this whole question of Canadian identity is.
No kidding. We've gone from loyalists to multiculturalism to shifting values and now a potential monarchical comeback.
And we're just getting started.
There's so much more to uncover as we continue this deep dive into the heart of Canadian identity, so stick with us. So we've been really digging into these historical roots of Canadian identity.
Yeah, and it's definitely not a simple story.
Not at all. There's so many layers.
And I think it's important to remember that no historical narrative is ever completely straightforward, you know?
Right. It's messy.
Exactly. We're talking about real people and real events, and those always come with a certain amount of complexity.
Absolutely. And when we talk about national identity, things can get pretty sensitive too.
For sure, people have strong feelings about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it's important to approach it with an open mind and be willing to hear different perspectives.
Totally. We're not here to judge, just to explore the various ways Canadian identity has been constructed and debated.
Right now, I'm still thinking about that whole nation of loyalists
Mm.
idea.
Hmm.
It's interesting, but is it really the whole story? I mean, Canada has a history of rebellions too, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of examples of Canadians challenging the status quo, pushing for change.
Like those movements for independence and those fights for rights.
Exactly. So while loyalty might be a big part of the picture, it's important to acknowledge those counter-narratives too.
The times when Canadians haven't just accepted authority, but actively tried to redefine it.
Right.
And even our second source, which is a bit more critical, acknowledges that shift away from traditional sources of authority.
You mean like the monarchy and the church?
Exactly, towards a more secular humanist way of thinking.
Right. And they see this as a defining feature of modern Canadian identity.
So if we're not defining ourselves through those institutions anymore, what takes their place?
What becomes the new glue that holds Canadian society together?
And their argument is that multiculturalism, while well-intentioned, might not have totally answered that question. They're saying that maybe in celebrating diversity so much, we've lost sight of what really binds us together as Canadians.
That's a really thought-provoking point.
It is. But I also think it's important to recognize the positive impact of multiculturalism,
Of course, it's fostered a more inclusive and welcoming society.
right? One that values people from all different backgrounds.
And that's something to be proud of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it seems like the key is finding that balance.
Yeah. How do we preserve a sense of shared identity while also embracing the richness that diversity brings?
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is. And that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting.
How do we navigate that tension?
How do we maintain a sense of national cohesion while also recognizing all the different identities that exist within Canada?
That's a tough question.
It is, but maybe it starts by acknowledging the validity of different viewpoints and having these open dialogues.
Just being willing to listen and learn from each other, even when we disagree.
I think you're right. And maybe as we grapple with these questions, we'll end up revisiting those traditional sources of identity in new ways.
You mean like the monarchy?
Yeah.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around that.
I know it sounds radical, but maybe it speaks to this deeper human need for stability and meaning.
Especially in a world that feels so unpredictable these days.
Exactly. So whether it's the monarchy or something else entirely, it seems like Canadians are still searching for that unifying force.
And that search for identity, both individually and collectively, is always ongoing.
Oh, absolutely. It's constantly being shaped by historical forces, social movements, our own personal experiences.
And in a country as diverse and dynamic as Canada, that search is bound to be complex.
Definitely multifaceted and always evolving.
Okay, so if we take a step back from all of this, What are some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into Canadian identity so far?
Well, one thing's for sure, there's no single definition of what it means to be Canadian.
Right, it's way more complicated than that.
Much more.
We've seen how historical narratives, cultural values, even political ideologies all play a role.
It's like each of those elements adds a different color to the overall picture.
And sometimes those colors clash,
Yeah.
which creates tension and debate.
But maybe it's through those clashes that we actually define and redefine what it means to be Canadian.
It's an ongoing conversation, always evolving.
Exactly. It's not static or fixed. It's fluid and dynamic.
It's like we're constantly weaving this tapestry of identity, adding new threads and patterns, but also honoring the fabric that came before.
I love that analogy. It really captures the essence of it.
So it's not just about the past, it's also about the present and the future.
And that's what makes this whole exploration so captivating.
It feels like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing more complexity and nuance with every layer.
And just when you think you've got it figured out, there's always another layer underneath.
That's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn and explore about who we are as a nation.
Exactly. And that journey of discovery is something we can all be a part of.
We've covered a lot of ground already, from those historical roots to multiculturalism to the search for meaning in a secular age.
So much to unpack.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to look ahead to the future.
How is Canadian identity going to evolve in the years to come?
What forces are going to shape our sense of self in the 21st century and beyond?
Right. In this world that's increasingly interconnected, where does Canadian identity fit in? Yeah, it really does feel like the world's getting smaller, doesn't it?
It does, with technology and information moving so fast across borders.
It makes you wonder how that impacts something like national identity, you know?
Right, because if those boundaries blur, do our identities start to fade? Some people argue we're moving towards a more globalized culture.
Where national borders matter less.
Exactly.
So instead of thinking of ourselves as Canadian first, maybe we start to see ourselves more as global citizens.
Part of this larger interconnected world.
Right, and then you've got social media and online communities where people are connecting across huge distances.
Based on shared interests or causes?
And they're not even thinking about geography.
It's wild to think about how those virtual connections might be reshaping how we see ourselves and where we belong.
So does that mean national identities will just disappear?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely possible, but it's also possible they just evolve.
Okay, so they adapt.
Right, maybe they become less rigid, more fluid.
More open to both local and global influences.
Exactly.
Like a hybrid identity.
Yeah, a blend of the local and the global. We might see more and more of these glocal identities, as they're called.
Where people have this deep connection to their local community, but also a broader global outlook, like having multiple layers of identity.
Right, each one informing and enriching the others.
And in a place as diverse as Canada, that kind of hybridity makes sense.
It does, and this brings us to another important trend shaping Canadian identity.
Which is?
The growing recognition of Indigenous cultures and perspectives.
Oh, absolutely. We can't talk about Canadian identity without talking about Indigenous peoples.
And their history on this land.
It's a fundamental part of who we are.
And there's been this real push towards reconciliation in recent years.
Yeah, like a deeper understanding of Indigenous knowledge and traditions.
We're seeing it everywhere, from education to the arts to government policy.
We're finally moving beyond just a European view of history.
And acknowledging all the different cultures that have shaped Canada.
So it's about recognizing the full tapestry of Canadian identity.
With all its threads and colors.
And all its complexity.
Exactly. And I think as we move forward, the challenge is going to be weaving those threads together.
In a way that creates this strong national fabric.
One that reflects those core values, inclusivity, respect, a shared sense of purpose.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
That's a good question. I think the main point is that Canadian identity isn't fixed.
It's not just one thing.
It's alive. It's constantly changing.
Shaped by so many different forces.
History, culture, our own individual experiences.
And as we've seen, it's not always a neat and tidy process.
It can be messy, full of contradictions, even a bit confusing sometimes.
But that's also what makes it so interesting.
I hope this deep dive has made you think critically about all of this.
To question your assumptions.
And ultimately to embrace that complexity.
Well said. It's been quite a journey.
Full of surprises.
And I know I've learned a lot.
Me too. And as we close, I want to leave you with a final question.
Okay, hit us with it.
What does Canadian identity mean to you personally?
How do you fit into this story?
Because at the end of the day, each of us has a role to play in shaping what it means to be Canadian.
And by having these conversations and listening to each other, we can create a tapestry that's both vibrant and strong.
Beautifully put.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canadian identity.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.